Welcome, everyone. I am Kim Mellon, co-director of the Wilton Historical Society, along with Allison Sanders, and I am so glad you've joined us tonight for the fifth lecture in our five-part lecture series, which is titled Connecticut Creativity, Vision plus Imagination plus Innovation. This is the Wilton Historical Society's 14th year of collaborating on this lecture series with our community partner, Wilton Library. Once again, we have enjoyed working with the library to create these programs and appreciate their partnership and your continuing participation. This year's series has been a lot of fun to put together. Each of the previous four talks brought to life creative innovators and ideas from which originated in Connecticut. We remotely traveled to Danbury to learn about composer Charles Ives, then to the famous Artists School of Westport, and north to Ridgefield to the home of Maurice Sendak, and then on to the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport. All of these programs were entertaining and informative. There were creative programs in their own right, and all together informed us of a few of Connecticut's most creative past residents. If you missed seeing the live talks, I encourage you to watch the programs on our and the library's YouTube channels and on our website as well. You can find the recordings. For the final lecture today, we are in for a real treat. Historian Emily Gifford will be presenting Gillette and Holmes, Theatrical Innovation from Connecticut to London and Back Again. Tonight's lecture is generously sponsored by Phil Loria and Elaine Ty-Loria. Thank you for your generous support, Phil and Elaine. Also, thank you to the Library Lecture Series Committee and those of you who made donations to either or both the library or the Historical Society when you registered. A note on tonight's Zoom protocol: you should remain muted without your video. Please stay muted throughout to avoid background noise. I encourage you to submit questions via the chat button on your Zoom screen directly to tonight's moderator, Steve Hudspeth, who will field them to Emily after the presentation. I will now turn your attention over to Steve, who will do the honor of introducing Emily. Steve, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kim. Look, if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, and who isn't, you're gonna love Emily Gifford's presentation. Kim and I got a preview of it a couple of days ago, and it's really fantastic. So you're gonna learn a lot about William Gillette, but first, let me tell you a little bit about Emily Gifford. She moved to Connecticut about 20 years ago from California, completed her bachelor's degree at Trinity, and then earned 2 MAs, one in church history at Yale Div, and the second in straight history, if that's the word for it, at Central Connecticut State University, specializing in post-Civil War US history. Now there, you'll recognize the name we all know. She was a student of a very popular presenter in this joint series over multiple years, Professor Matt Warschauer. She took Matt's graduate seminar on historiography and ended up contributing a paper to Inside Connecticut and the Civil War: Essays on One State Struggles, the volume that Matt edited in conjunction with the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. One of Emily's special areas of interest is in social movements and religious history, and she researched and wrote her master's thesis, and this I'm mentioning only because I'm Episcopalian, a master's thesis on Clinton Jones, an Episcopalian priest whose work involved helping combat LGBT discrimination. She also takes a keen interest in pop culture, having lectured on the first Bond girl. Well, that's what we ought to get on here. And the way in which mid-20th century, now considered ancient history, of course, Hollywood films depicted women accused of crimes. But you'll see that she has reserved a very special place in her heart for William Gillette and all that he did to bring the Sherlock Holmes canon to the stage, both here in the US and in the UK, with his own adaptations of Doyle's work, and especially with his remarkable acting that left its mark on the characterization of Sherlock Holmes ever after. If you have questions, as Kim mentioned, we certainly hope you will, please put them in the chat. I'll do my best to record them and put them to Emily once her main presentation is presented and we go in the Q&A period. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to present to you Emily Gifford.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I had to giggle a little bit because you said straight history, and in a sense that's true, but I also wrote my thesis about LGBT issues, so in a sense it's not true at all. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the sponsors of this event and to Kim for inviting me. And I hope to be able to at least scratch the surface of William Gillette, or Will as I've come to know him, and his contributions to the world in general and Connecticut in particular. As Kim reiterated, the theme of this lecture series has been Connecticut creativity, vision, plus imagination, and plus innovation. And in my way of thinking about those topics, I tend to think that there are kind of two sides to that coin of invention and innovation. And one is people who just come up with something completely new that nobody's ever seen before, seemingly plucking these ideas out of the very air itself. The other side of invention and innovation and creativity and vision is people who can take those brand new ideas and put them to new uses, new applications, and to refine them. Now, Gillette was both an innovator of original ideas, but really his real strength was in tinkering and refining and finding new applications for technologies and ideas that other people may have pioneered and that he was able to then bring forward into a wider audience. But before I talk about William's vision, imagination, and innovation, I want to talk about the Connecticut of it all. Oh dear. There's Will. As you can see, he was born in 1853. He was born in Hartford, and in 1937, he died in Hartford. But before I open it up to questions, I am going to go ahead and tell you about his background. His parents were Frances Gillette, who was born in 1807 in Old Windsor, which is now Bloomfield, and Elizabeth Daggett Hooker, known as Eliza, who was also born in Old Windsor in 1813. And she was a direct descendant of Thomas Hooker, whom we know for founding the first European settlement of Connecticut back in the 17th century. Frances Gillette was descended from French Protestants who fled France and the religious persecutions there, spent a couple of generations in England before joining the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 when that was founded. Some of the Gillettes went further west, and some of them went to the southwest to Connecticut, and it is from those forebears that Gillette was descended. They married in the 1830s, and had 6 children. Now, for those of us who are students of history, it's kind of interesting to see that one family can encapsulate so much of the 19th century experience. And I have all of the children up here. The oldest child, born in 1836, was Francis Ashbel, known as Frank. Then came Elizabeth, named for her mother, and she was called Lily. And aside from Francis Ashbel, all of these children had Hooker as their middle name in honor of their mother's maiden name. So Lily was born in 1838, Edward was born in 1840, Robert in 1842, Mary was born in 1843, and like so many of that time, did not survive childhood, dying in 1845. Much later came William, who was born in 1853. Now, these children, not all of them survived beyond adulthood even, because Frank, as you can see, died in 1859. He had tuberculosis, which was a common 19th century ailment, and went west to Sacramento, which had a warm, dry climate, which attracted many tubercular patients. And he became a farmer there. He went there when he was about 18, and he farmed successfully there for about 4 years before the so-called galloping consumption caught up with him. His brother, Robert, went to California to retrieve his remains. Lily married in the 1850s to a man named, who was a banker and the brother-in-law of Charles Dudley Warren, the writer and newspaper owner. He will feature heavily in this presentation later on. Their son Edward went west to Iowa to look at land that Francis had invested in, and set up their newspaper and eventually
Emily, I think we lost you. You're muted.
You did, yes.
Good.
Okay. Can you see me now?
Both see and hear you just fine.
Oh, can you see the slide with the children on it?
No, you're
I
not sharing your screen anymore.
Okay. Oops.
So while you're doing that, I hear I have to find another name than straight history to describe what history other than religious history is. I'll work on that.
Okay. I'm not seeing the opportunity to share my screen here.
Well, you are a co-host. On the bottom, you don't see the green.
Oh, I got it. Got it. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Times are rough all over, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me get this back into the full screen mode. Okay, so we're back in business. I don't know where I dropped out. I was describing the fates of the children, and I think I would mention that Lily married in the 1850s. She married a man called George Warren, who was the brother of Charles Dudley Warren, who was a co-owner of the Hartford Courant and who will be figuring into this presentation later as well. And that Ed had gone out to Iowa to look after some land that his father had invested in and ended up settling there, eventually representing Iowa in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. That was later on in the 1870s. He was with the Greenback Party. Robert was born in 1842 and eventually died in 1865. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And as I said, Mary died in infancy and Will was born in 1853. Now, Robert, as you can guess from the date of his death, he died during the Civil War. He originally served at Antietam, survived that, got invalided home with typhoid, then re-enlisted in the Union Navy and was killed the morning after the surrender of Fort Fisher when he was ashore and a munitions dump exploded, killing 200 Confederate and Union personnel alike. That was a devastating loss to the family. And as you can see over here, this is the monument they erected for him in the Hooker family plot at Riverside Cemetery in Farmington. And that's the most prominent monument that the Gillette family put up there. And that was for Robert. He also never married or had children. While all of these children were being born and living their lives and unfortunately coming to their deaths, Francis was, let me go back to Francis, there he is, was also active in politics. He was educated originally at Yale. He studied law at Washington College, as it was then, which is now Trinity College. But he, in an interesting career move, he kind of felt that his health wasn't good enough to continue studying the law. So he dropped out of college to become a farmer, which I'm not sure what the ailment was that precluded the study of law, but was fine for farming. But he was very successful as a farmer. He also entered politics and was returned to the State House many times in the Free Soil Party. He was very progressive. He was an abolitionist. His barn in Old Windsor was a stop on the Underground Railroad, which is something I understand he has in common with the good people of Wilton of that time as well. He was also a proponent for women's suffrage and public education, and also a temperance advocate, which at the time temperance was considered a progressive cause. He eventually was instrumental in founding the Republican Party here in Connecticut. He also, with the money he earned from being a successful farmer, went into land speculation with his brother-in-law, John Hooker, brother of Elizabeth Daggett Hooker, and husband also of Isabella Beecher Hooker. And together they bought 140 acres in Hartford. It was farmland that they bought from William Gillette, and they called it Nook Farm. This is a sweet map of Nook Farm. As you can see, this is representing how it would have looked, the map of it in 1885. When Gillette and Hooker bought the land, like I said, 100 acres, there was only one building on it. It was the old Gillette farmhouse. This is number 8 down here. And that is the house in which Will was born just a few months after that purchase was made. Before too long, the Gillettes built at their own house, the build started in 1856. It's this number 7 here next to these outbuildings. They completed it in 1857, and there it is. Now, Will, really from the time he was 11, was essentially an only child, with the older siblings who died or in Ed's case, was out in Iowa, and Lily, she lived in the neighborhood, but she was starting her own household and family. So, I mean, they were friendly, obviously, but she was more distant than you might think of a sibling as being. So Will had a lot of space in which to roam and play. Pretty much the entire attic up in the 3rd floor was his domain, and up there he built a stationary model of a locomotive because he was fascinated with trains and other gadgets. And out here in the lawn, he would put up scale railroad tracks, little passenger cars and the like. Also up here on rainy days and in the winter, he constructed a puppet theater complete with footlights. Now, he was using marionette puppets. He would write little sketches and plays for them to perform in. When he was 13, he and a friend had access to a printing press, which they enterprisingly made available to people for a small fee. And they also started a journal they called Hail Columbia. This is 2 13-year-old boys who managed to sell subscriptions to it to their Nook Farm neighbors at $1 a year, which was a pretty good chunk of change back then. They kept it up for a year. They would publish little patriotic stories and jokes and baseball scores, and they also got some contributions. Lily Gillette Warren would contribute to it, as would her brother-in-law, Charles Dudley Warren, who was, as I said, co-owner of the Hartford Courant, and later to become somewhat of a literary figure in his own right. So Gillette was a curious, enterprising, and rather intellectual young man. Now, as I mentioned, Francis was a big proponent of public education, so all of his sons were educated at Hartford Public High School. While Will was there, he became interested in oratory, rhetorical skills, what they used to call declaiming. He would recite and declaim famous speeches, won prizes for it. He also became interested in theater beyond puppetry and made friends with a lot of Hartford youth who were interested in the theater, including Otis Skinner, who would later be a giant of Broadway, both in writing plays and criticism. They were lifelong friends from those early days in Hartford. When Will graduated from high school in 1873, he was a little bit on the older side. He was 19. He seems to have suffered from tuberculosis, which most of his life was more or less in what you could call remission. But I think that may have kind of delayed his education a little bit from time to time when he was a teenager. And he really wanted to pursue a career in the theater. Now, at that time, the theater was considered a disreputable profession to be a part of. In fact, it was kind of considered a disreputable kind of entertainment even to attend. So that was, could have been a little bit of a scandal. However, his parents, while it wasn't their first, second, or even third choice for what they would have liked him to do with his life, they were nevertheless somewhat supportive. And when Francis took him to the train station, this was in the fall of 1873, just after he turned 20, he had decided that he needed to learn more about theatrical productions and how to act on stage beyond just reciting speeches. So he wanted to go find an apprenticeship out in the provinces, in the sticks. And when Francis took him to the train station, the story goes that he dropped him off, telling him, "I've dropped off two sons at the same train station who were unable to return. Please make yourself an exception." So, you know, I'm sure Will made a solemn promise to do his utmost on that, and went off to Cincinnati, St. Louis, and eventually New Orleans, where he served unpaid apprenticeships with stock theater companies. And during those unpaid apprenticeships, Francis would send him money to live on. And when one of these apprenticeships ran out in New Orleans, he was sort of stranded there, and Francis made sure he had the money to come home. Now, when he came home, he went to New York, where he studied at City University of New York. But he probably spent more time going to the theater than he did in the lecture hall. And he would periodically return to Nook Farm, and it was there in Nook Farm, which was very much a center of vision, imagination, and innovation and Connecticut creativity, that he got a big, huge break. One of his neighbors was, of course, Mark Twain. And Mark Twain and his wife were friendly with Charles Dudley Warren and his wife, and one night at a dinner party, the men were complaining about how there just weren't any good novels being published. And the wife said, you know, if anybody here is in a position to do something about this tragic situation, it might be, I don't know, you two. Maybe not quite that sarcastically, but the upshot was the men collaborated on a novel called The Gilded Age. They also, which was a very successful literary and commercial venture, they adapted it for the stage. It became known by the title of Colonel Sellers. It's a stage production, and they managed to get a part for Will. It was not a speaking part. It was a walk-on, non-speaking role, but it was paid theatrical employment. And Will was able to debut at for the hometown crowd in Hartford. He went on up to Boston, where he was graduated to a speaking role as the foreman of the jury, and he had one line, 2 words, not guilty. I'm sure he delivered it with all the conviction you could hope for. While he was in Boston, he again attended lectures, took classes from Boston University, again, spending more time in the theater than in the lecture hall, this time a little bit more productively, because he was able to get an understudy position in the play Faint Heart Never Won Fair Lady, also known as Broken Hearts. And there was an opportunity for him to stand in for the role and have a speaking role and a paid engagement in the theater, which he extended throughout the run of the play. When the play stopped running, however, oh, I forgot to advance my slides. There's a picture of the Globe Theater. That's just the seating chart. You can imagine how lavish this thing would have been. When his part ran out in Broken Hearts, he didn't have a contract with the theater. So he did what an enterprising Connecticut Yankee does. He created his own one-man show. This was a costume, as you can see in the ad here, which is a classified ad from the Hartford Courant. This was an evening of costume impersonations, comic character sketches, and humorous selections. Throughout 1875, 1876, and into 1877, he performed this around New England, particularly in Connecticut, performing at fairly large venues like McDonough Theater here in Middletown, also at, sorry, distracted for a moment there, at McDonough Theater here in Middletown, also at the Irving Theater in Waterbury, and also played in venues in Glastonbury, New Britain, and New Milford. And the Housatonic Ray, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, unfortunately, and I apologize for that. The Housatonic Ray described this evening here as being thoroughly unobjectionable in every respect. Now, that's a kind of faint praise, but they did go on to say that it was the kind of entertainment that New Milfordians had never before been able to enjoy at home. So they were kind of had the Victorian understatement, but then they had the Victorian overstatement a little bit. Now, this one-man show was, in fact, the costume impersonations part of it was that he would dress up in costume for various plays that were making the rounds in Boston and New York, Philadelphia, places like that, and would declaim, deliver, and otherwise interpret the monologues in the style of, as you can see here, Edwin Booth, Lawrence Barrett, John T. Raymond. These are all people he would have seen in person, and in fact, John T. Raymond played the lead in Colonel Sellers, so he actually would have literally worked with him. This was not an unusual kind of entertainment for people to enjoy. People who couldn't make it to those population centers really wanted to know what was going on in the theater, and obviously they didn't have anything other than photographs and these kinds of shows to kind of keep them clued into what was happening. The comic character sketches were little, exactly what it sounds like, bits of Will's own devising, including one that I think sounds like it was probably a hoot, which was the man who was called upon to teach Sunday school with no warning, no preparation, and no experience with public speaking. I can just imagine that that would be a classic setup that I think you probably see anybody doing in improv theater even today. Maybe not Sunday school, but apparently it had him in the aisles. The humorous selections ended with him impersonating Mark Twain, reciting the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County to great acclaim. As you can see, the admission at Hartford Seminary Hall in June of 1877 was 35 cents, which was about what a skilled worker could expect to make for about an hour's work. So it was not hugely expensive, but neither was it a total throwaway of a ticket. However, by 1878, he kind of stepped back from the stage because unfortunately, Francis became very ill with what turned out to be his final illness. And Will stayed with him at Nook Farm with his father, and his mother was definitely still alive at that point, helping to take care of him, keep him company, enjoy his presence for as long as he could. During that time, which was slightly over a year, Will also started writing plays, and one of his projects was an adaptation of a German play, Der Bibliotheker, which means the librarian, but he adapted it into English as the professor. And this wasn't just simply a matter of translating the play from German to English. In fact, I don't know if he was fluent enough in German to do that, or if he was maybe working off of a word-for-word translation. He was not just adapting it from German, however, he was adapting it for American audiences. So many of his, he would do this many times during his career, and many of these adaptations would end up being very, very loose indeed, because especially with something like Der Bibliotheker, the professor, which was a comedy, and comedy does not translate well always in all occasions. So he wanted to make sure it was something that Americans could understand, if not relate to, then at least laugh at or with. Now, when Francis died, he left his estate divided. 50% went to Eliza, his widow. The other 50% was divided evenly among the three children, with a special earmark for Will of Francis's books that he had originally intended to leave those to Robert, but with Robert predeceasing him, he gave them to Will, feeling that he was the one who would get the most use and appreciation for them. However, the estate was not in great shape. Francis Gillette, in his land deals with his brother-in-law Hooker, Nook Farm had been a very successful deal. The thousands of acres he purchased out in Iowa that Ed had gone out to oversee, that didn't pan out as well, at least not in the short term. And also he had given some land to Lily and her husband when they married, and he remained in debt. And also the context here is that 1879 was just when America and, well, North America and Europe were trying to climb out of a huge international financial crisis that started with the Panic of 1873. So Will really, really needed to get out there and be earning money to support himself and his mother. And again, Mark Twain stepped in and provided $3,000 in backing, which again, our skilled worker who made 35 cents an hour would probably take at least a couple of years to earn that. Sorry, more like 3 or 4 years to earn that kind of money. And Mark Twain had a lot of money and invested a lot of money, not always wisely. He famously would throw $3,000 a month for almost 4 years at a typesetting machine that never worked. So the $3,000 that he used to bankroll his neighbor was not chump change exactly, but I think he probably had a more reasonable expectation of getting it back. The other thing he did was he provided an introduction to his contact in the theater, who was a man named, here we go, Charles Frohman, who was one of 3 brothers. The other 2 were Gustav and Daniel, who were very much innovators in their own right when it came to being theatrical impresarios. As you can see from this portrait that was done in 1914, he was kind of the, may have well been the origin of the stereotype of the cigar-chomping, fast-talking Broadway producer. And you'll notice that he was a couple of years younger than Will, and he died in 1915. A side note, he died aboard the deck of the Lusitania, heroically, talking with a Vanderbilt, which just goes to show that all of these people were tremendously interesting and very, very stylish, but they weren't from Connecticut, so moving on. Another innovator of that time was Mckay at the Madison Square Theater, which was the concern that the Frohman brothers managed. He was an actor who was the first American to perform Hamlet in London to mixed reviews. He also was developed a lot of theatrical technology, over 100 patents, and one of them here in the Madison Square Theater, which looks very unprepossessing. He invented a double stage, which was what it sounds like, one stage atop another that could be raised and lowered for quick scene changes. That was not a theatrical invention that really caught on too much at the time because it was just too expensive to doubly excavate into the ground to create that. However, one of the things that he was able to do using what was state-of-the-art technology at the time was to develop, to replace them, to get rid of the footlights that were used to illuminate the stage from below and put the lights up above, indirect and spotlights both. And he was able to do this because the Madison Square Theater had state-of-the-art ventilation. So he was able to put gas lamps into glass boxes that were very well ventilated without causing problems for the actors or the audience or indeed the building. However, he was perpetually broke and had signed a really, really bad contract with the Froman brothers, and he ended up leaving. His departure from the Madison Square Theater opened up a door for Will, who was happy to receive the opportunity to be a stage director. However, he lamented that it was only for my own plays. However, 1881, he was able to open with The Professor, which had gone through many revisions and out-of-town tryouts because it was, again, Gillette's first stage play, and he wasn't entirely adept at going directly from the page to the stage without getting audience reaction. He got much better at that, of course, as he got older and more developed as a playwright and a performer. Now here's a little illustration of that. And as you can see from this program on the side, it went into it went into at least 3 seasons. So this was a huge hit for him. And another innovation that the Froman brothers had was that they would have up to 5 touring companies with any given property at any given time. This was made possible also by the development of the railroad in the United States. And it was while he was on tour with The Professor in the city of Detroit, that this was in January of 1882, that Will looked out from the stage, looked into the audience and saw somebody he really wanted to get to know. And he managed to get an introduction to this person and married her just a few months later. Her name was Helen Nichols, and she came from a relatively affluent background, although privilege doesn't mean immunization from sadness and tragedy. Her mother and father divorced when she was young. Her mother remarried, and she had a young half-brother named Hal, who became very friendly with Gillette when he was older. And she was born in 1860, so she's about 6.5 years younger than Gillette. They had a very happy marriage. She was a very well-bred and, for the time, not much formal education, but certainly well-read, self-taught, very interested in theater, obviously. And she had a very gentle and demure presentation to society. And however, she was very adventurous. She loved to travel, and she traveled with Will whenever he'd go on tour, even across the oceans, throughout their marriage. And it was a very successful marriage, and it led to a very productive and creative time in Will's life. He actually filed for and got several patents, all of them for the same device. And here we go. This is a time stamp, which is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a device that a clerk could use to stamp the date and time on any document so that everybody would have a record of who handled which document on what day and even at what time. Now, he tinkered with this endlessly because that's the kind of guy Will was, and he filed 4 patents for this same basic design over a 1-year period and was granted each of them by the patent office. This one is actually the 3rd patent, and I chose this one just simply because, look at those drawings. Aren't they beautiful? I just love them. He also patented a method for creating sound effects. You may be aware of this, but when horses' hoofbeats were simulated during theatrical productions, that was frequently using 2 coconut halves that would be banged against a marble surface to simulate hoofbeats. Well, Will didn't like that. He thought, it's not very realistic. All hoofbeats don't sound alike. So he developed a method, which he got a patent for. There's no nifty drawing of it because it was a method, not a device. It involved using clappers on different surfaces so that you could simulate just not only cobblestones or even marble, but also turf or packed earth, whatever the story called for. Now, during this time, Will was also writing original plays, not just adaptations, including a Civil War drama called Held by the Enemy. Now, Held by the Enemy, there had been Civil War plays. They were usually very moralistic, very bombastic, tended to be very Confederacy good, Union bad, or Union good, Confederacy bad, and had all sorts of moral diatribes. What Gillette did that was new and different with the Civil War drama was to really get into and explore the dramatic possibilities of the interpersonal conflicts, cousin against cousin, that sort of thing, and really how ordinary people reacted in times of war. And however, this is the 21st century, and we have to acknowledge certain things. He was very much writing it with a white audience in mind, a white protagonist, white audience. And with that in mind, let's take a look at this particularly unfortunate promotional material. Okay, as we say in the 21st century, yikes. We have this kind of caricature of an African-American person with this strange dialect. I know I sound like I'm condemning Will Gillette, and I don't mean to be so harsh on him because, of course, hindsight is 20/20. I just want to realize that this was kind of the reality of the theater at the time. Although it was becoming more accessible to middle class and respectable audiences, there was a whole portion of the population that was shut out, underrepresented, or not necessarily very well represented. So I'm just going to sit with that and move on. The next production that he had was A Legal Wreck, which was an adaptation of a French sort of semi-melodrama, semi-comedy. Will wrote the novelization of this, and the novelization tie-in was actually something that was going on with plays. In fact, somebody else had written a novelization tie-in for Held by the Enemy. And this one was actually written by Will, and I think it was the only novel that he ever wrote. And it was, again, based on an adaptation that he was doing. This was opening in August of 1888, and back to the Frohmans and their innovations, they had a publicity stunt. They got everybody interested in something that was happening on the Brooklyn Bridge. It was an apparent suicide, a body going over the railing and into the water. When the police fished this alleged body out, it turned out to be a dummy with a note attached to the chest reading, "Go see a legal wreck." I'm not saying that he invented trolling the audience for publicity, but he invented trolling the audience for publicity. I don't know if Will knew about this. Possibly, probably. I don't know that anybody really minded that much. Certainly it would be a firestorm today. Again, we're looking back with 21st century eyes on 19th century occurrences. The play was not particularly successful. In fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe, one of Gillette's Nook Farm neighbors, and normally a friend with a sympathetic view for his artistic pursuits, referred to A Legal Wreck as a total wreck. Now, I have to say, Will kind of put that title, he threw that title out there, and I can't really blame her for catching it and running with it. So that didn't do very well, but that's the vagaries of theater. And actually, Will was about to experiencing something much worse. In late August of 1888, he and Helen were taking a little bit of a break in Greenwich, Connecticut, and she contracted appendicitis and peritonitis, and unfortunately in those days, that was not something you could survive. I think it was actually not until the next year that there was actually diagnostic criteria for appendicitis, and certainly the first appendectomy was not conducted until I think it was 1893. He was devastated by this loss, and she was buried in the Hooker family plot at Riverside Cemetery. This is Riverside Cemetery in Farmington, looking out from the old part of the cemetery toward the Farmington River. He would actually almost haunt the graveyard. There was a story that the students at Miss Porter's, which was only a couple of hundred yards away, would see him there at all hours of the day, mourning his lost wife. However, he did go to work and started working on plays and acting. However, by late 1889, his tuberculosis came back and he was having trouble managing the symptoms. So he went to North Carolina to a town called Tryon in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And once again, he was a pioneer. He was one of the first of the theatrical folk to settle there and ended up coalescing an entire artist colony there, mostly theatrical actors and directors, writers, and to a lesser extent, visual artists as well. And that Tryon, he built a cottage there. It started off as 2 rooms, but he kept adding to it and coming up with very ingenious doors and locking mechanicals, which was kind of a dress rehearsal almost for Gillette Castle that he would build here in Connecticut. Unfortunately, I have no pictures of this. It's currently in private hands. However, the property that that was on is now a private community called Gillette Woods, even to this day. So that certainly people in Tryon still remember his presence in their town. He was ready to go back to work in 1894 with Much Johnson, which was an adaptation of a French play. And I'm kind of pressed for time, so I'm going to have to rush here. That was a good hit for him. And he had also been working on a new original drama called Secret Service, which was another Civil War drama, which I think people enjoyed that even more than Held by the Enemy for its kind of looking into the interpersonal relationships that that the war put such a destabilizing strain on. Now, I can talk about theatrical innovation as much as I want, and we can talk about how he was doing all these things that were new and exciting and different. However, we might want to get another perspective. There was a revival of Secret Service in 1977 by the Phoenix Theater, and here's one of the actors talking about her experience with that production.
I actually read somewhere too, I had never seen this in any of the official filmographies, but I found a little note that your TV debut was not Holocaust, but in something called Secret Service, which was a Civil War melodrama from 1977.
Well, that was actually the Phoenix Theater, which I had worked in the Phoenix, my first season in New York. And that was one of the plays I was in. It was a melodrama from the Civil War era. It was awful. It was a vehicle for William Gillette, who was a famous actor in the 19th century. And John Lithgow played that part.
Told me so himself. Your orders are to stay. You are given a special commission on the War Department Telegraph Service, and you will be in charge of...
No, I won't take it. I couldn't take it, Miss Varney.
You'll do that much for me?
It's for you that I'll do nothing of the sort. If ever you think of me again, remember, I refused it.
But you can't refuse it. It's the President's request. It's with the message it bears.
Okay. Hang on, I'm having a little bit of a technical issue here. Okay, that just goes to show that what to audiences of the time was fresh and new and exciting and different was, to Meryl Streep at least, awful. So that incidentally, that performance is available on DVD if you have mind to show that. I'm sorry, I'm having a technical issue here. Okay, sorry about that. However, Miss Streep feels about that play. It was a huge, huge success. And actually, that was the play he performed in more than any other, even more than Sherlock Holmes. He performed in it something like 1,700 times over his life, including an international tour going to America, England, and France. So we're going to leave Will for a moment touring with Secret Service, and we're going to talk a little bit about Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, first published Sherlock Holmes in 1887. The Great Detective was a great hit, so he published on Sherlock Holmes between 1886 and 1893, and here's an illustration from the Strand Illustrated magazine by Sidney Paget. This is Sidney Paget's conception of what Holmes would have looked like. In 1893, Doyle famously killed off Sherlock since he was tired of writing about him, frankly. However, the public could not get enough of Sherlock, and a man named Charles Rogers, who was an actor and playwright, kind of did a bootleg play of Sherlock, which performed all over England and was very popular, but Doyle wasn't seeing a dime off of that, or a farthing, I suppose. And that was a problem for him because he wanted money to build a nice country estate, but he didn't want to write new Sherlock material. So he wrote a stage play that was basically an adaptation of A Scandal in Bohemia, sent it to his agent, who sent it along to Charles Frohman. Charles Frohman looked at it and said, if you really want a commercial success, we should turn this over to Will Gillette to write that adaptation. And Doyle was happy to do that. His only condition was that Sherlock Holmes must not have a romance. So Gillette set to work on it while he was touring with Secret Service. And while he was in San Francisco with Secret Service, he was staying at the Palace Hotel, but most of the company, their props and their papers were at the Baldwin Hotel. Unfortunately, there was a big fire and people died and all of the props and papers were destroyed. Charles Frohman talked it up to the New York Times like it was a huge theatrical loss and that it was going to be a really, really tough uphill slog for Gillette to reconstitute the work. But within a week, he had a new draft. Contemporaries said that he probably had backups all over the place. By May of 1899, he took it to England. He met with Doyle in person for the first time. They had exchanged they had a cute little telegraph exchange. He wrote to Doyle and said, may I marry Holmes? He wanted to be able to marry Sherlock Holmes off. And Doyle replied, you may marry him, murder him, do what you like with him. At that point, I think Doyle, the only writing he wanted to do relative to Sherlock Holmes was to just endorse royalty checks. So this was when Gillette was developing his costume and appearance for Holmes. And this is when his lasting impression on our visual culture comes into it. He would wear the deerstalker and the country kind of outfit that Sherlock Holmes in the stories would only have worn outdoors in the country. He would wear that pretty much whenever he was on stage, unless he was wearing the dressing gown, which in the books was described as solid blue or purple or even mouse colored in one story. This was Gillette's own very sumptuous robe that I think he felt had more visual interest, and that would of course be of interest to a stage actor and director. He also introduced the curved calabash style of pipe. I think that that framed his face very nicely and allowed the audience to see what any expressions he might be making while smoking the pipe. And I think it was also easier to handle as a prop while just gesticulating. Now, of course, we are familiar with these visual cues for Sherlock from performances from actors like Basil Rathbone. And even in, this is in 1939, and even in 1976, Nicole Williamson. The magnifying glass was another Gillette innovation. In the stories, Holmes's magnifying glass was a small pocket affair. Of course, on stage, you want something that's larger and more easy for the audience to see what's happening, what's going on. So there we are with these kinds of things. And another innovation that was possibly Gillette, possibly others working with Gillette, in the stories, Holmes would say the phrase elementary, and he would also refer to people as my dear fellow. Gillette married those two phrases as elementary, my dear fellow, and at some point it became elementary, my dear Watson. I'm not sure, there are different editions of the plays with different iterations of that line. It may have been an ad lib by Gillette or one of the other actors, but that's certainly an enduring legacy from the Gillette productions. Here we have a letter that Doyle wrote in 1908 when Gillette was touring extensively with Sherlock Holmes. So this was something that was for sale recently, and this is an example of somebody writing to Doyle asking for permission to stage Sherlock Holmes, and he just said, fine, whatever, but you have to get permission from Mr. Frohman. Sherlock Holmes, like when it debuted in, sorry, going back in time a little bit for a moment, it debuted in November of 1899 in the London Theater, excuse me, in New York Theater, the Garrick Theater. It was a huge hit, and again, he toured with that, and many other touring companies licensed it, and it was a huge moneymaker for him for the rest of his life. And he didn't write any more plays after Sherlock. However, he continued to act in other people's plays, including a couple by J.M. Barrie, The Admirable Crichton in 1903, and Dear Brutus in 1919. There he is with an unknown Watson. There is a notice for Dear Brutus, which was in 1919, starring a very young Helen Hayes, whom he took under his wing. At this point in his career, he had gone from matinee idol to being the so-called dean of the American theater and was mentoring younger actors such as Miss Hayes and others of her generation. She actually went and stayed with him at his Connecticut castle on more than one occasion. Here we have the Aunt Polly. Going back to 1896, he had become interested in houseboating and had purchased a boat called the Holy Terror. By 1898, he had commissioned his own yacht, the Aunt Polly, which was finished in 1900 and further modified in 1901. It was named Aunt Polly for somebody he'd known in North Carolina. He used to cruise with it around Long Island Sound and up the Connecticut River. And in 1913, that was when he spotted a hilly piece of land overlooking the Connecticut River called Seventh Sister, and he purchased it for his retirement home, which was, of course, Gillette Castle. Construction started in 1914 with a gang of 20 men, and Gillette stated the Aunt Polly moored below. This is very high on a cliff overlooking the Connecticut River. The Aunt Polly was moored below, and he used to drive the foreman just completely crazy, coming up with different modifications he wanted to make. It was a steel frame with a local fieldstone, excuse me. It was a steel frame with a facade of local fieldstone. And certainly all of the innovation that he brought to staging plays, he brought to the castle. He designed several doors for it. 47 unique doors. He designed all of them. They were hand carved, although not by Gillette, and he designed unique locking mechanisms for all of them as well. He also, here is a view of the interior after it became a tourist attraction following his death. He also had a unique system of mirrors where he could stand up here on the gallery overlooking his great room and kind of watch his guests and see who was there and kind of time his entrances dramatically and see who was trying to get into the liquor cabinet, which he had locked with one of his own mechanisms, and he could step in at the exact moment to save the day with the key so everybody could access the goodies within. He also had a mirror where he could just see who was in the great room. He would step out, take a look, and either time his own entrance very dramatically or for comic effect, or sometimes he would just turn around and go back into his bedroom. He valued his privacy and his solitude, his quiet time. He was a very he was a genial and gregarious host of people like Albert Einstein and Calvin Coolidge. But again, he could also be somewhat aloof and reserved. He had many cats on the property, and his friends kind of drew a parallel between his own sometimes somewhat withdrawn nature and the personalities of the cats, which are commemorated still to this day with these statues you'll see around the castle. He was also continued his childhood interest with trains and actually built a quarter-scale 3-mile train track around the grounds of the castle. That was completed in 1927, which was about, the castle was completed in 1919, so that was about 8 years after the castle was completed. The train was completed, and it had it had a Grand Central Station and even an 125th Street station, which still stands to this day. The tracks were removed long ago, but there's a very well-graded path that you can follow, and there's even a tunnel. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to touch on everything that he managed to accomplish in his lifetime. However, I'm brave enough to try showing once more another clip, which is of him when he was in 1916, when he was about 61 years old. He actually filmed an adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, which was thought to be lost until 2014. And somebody's put this on YouTube with a glass disc recording that he made in 1936. It's very rough audio. And keep in mind that the audio was recorded 20 years removed from the video. So there's not a matchup or anything like that. It's just a chance to see and hear him in action. So let me put that up for you. I'm just going to show a couple of minutes of a much longer clip.
You are about to hear a short reenactment of one of the most famed characterizations in the history of the American stage, Mr. William Gillette in scenes from his own play, Sherlock Holmes. The curtain rises on Sherlock Holmes's room in Baker Street. the page boy has just ushered in Dr. Watson, and Holmes, who has been smoking his pipe in the red glow of the hearth fire, rises to greet him.
Watson, my dear fellow, how are you, Holmes? I'm delighted to see you. Perfectly delighted, upon my word I am. But, I'm so sorry to observe left you in this way. She has gone on a little visit, but how did you know? How did I? Well, I like that. How did I know? How do I know anything? How do I know that you opened an office and resumed the practice of medicine without telling me a word about it? How do I know you've been getting yourself very wet lately, that you have an extremely careless servant girl, and that you've moved your dressing table to the other side of your room? Oh, Holmes, if you'd lived a few centuries ago, they'd have burned you alive. Such a conflagration would have saved me a great deal of trouble and expense. Tell me now, how did you know all that? Oh, too simple to talk about. Scratches and clumsy cuts, my dear fellow, on the inner side of your shoe there, just where the firelight strikes it. Scratches, cuts. Somebody scraped away crusted mud and did it badly. Scraped the shoe along with it. There's your wet feet and your careless servant all on one shoe. Face badly shaved on.
Okay, I don't want to that clip to wear out its welcome, because that is very difficult to listen to. However, you can watch the whole thing. Well, it's not the whole thing. It's a 9-minute clip with that audio that's available on YouTube, and I think that Kim will have a link for you for that. The entire silent movie with a nice new score is available on DVD, and it also shows up on TCM from time to time, so you can keep an eye out for that if you're interested. I have one more clip. Still feeling kind of brave, so I'm going to show that, and that is Gillette talking about his the railway that he constructed at Gillette Castle. You'll get a better sense for him sounding a bit more animated. This was in 1927. That audio recording, again, was 1936, which was recorded not too long before he died. So he was getting a little old and tired at that time. But here we go.
Ever since I was an infant, and for all I know before, I've had the idea that I'd like to drive a locomotive. People didn't tell me that I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, but I've often heard that I was born with a steam engine in my mouth. And at last I've got one. I had to build one so as to drive it. It's a long while since that occurred, but now I've got my wish at last. And I'd like to see if some of you would like to come and take a ride, or maybe. We'll have a little ride around the place. What do you say? All right, we'll do it. Good thing, yes. All right. Goodbye.
Okay, and so that was Will in his own words with his own railroad. And you may have spotted something about his voice that was another innovation that he participated in. It wasn't exclusive to him, but that's the mid-Atlantic accent, which was a kind of a marriage of a Eastern Seaboard, American Eastern Seaboard accent with received pronunciation English accent. You certainly would hear that from his fellow Hartfordian, Katharine Hepburn, later on in film history. In 1937, the tuberculosis came back for a final time, and Will went up to Hartford for medical treatment. And he was very optimistic about his chances. He was planning to build a bridge that would be ready to enjoy by the summer of 1937. However, early in the morning of April 29th, 1937, he suffered a pulmonary hemorrhage and consequent congestive heart failure, and that was the last of William Gillette. He's buried in the Hooker family plot next to his wife. I was there last Sunday and took this picture, and I don't know if you can see, but there's a little statue of a cat and a little silhouette of Sherlock Holmes.
Make a screenshot.
Okay, there we go.
What happened?
Hello? Hello?
Okay, Emily, I think you could just go on.
Okay, I don't know what that
I don't know
was.
where that came from, but it's fine.
Okay, oops, sorry. Am I sharing my screen again?
You're not sharing it right now.
Okay, I was trying to ascertain what was going on, so, okay. We'll go back to sharing the screen and that detail of the grave. There you go. I hope you can see that a little bit better. I have a detail there. There's the kind of shadowy, that's the metal silhouette, and there's the cat. Now, all of these visual tropes that Gillette developed for Sherlock, I think there's been some pushback among more modern actors who have kind of tried to go back to the original or to try to make the role their own. As we can see, Jeremy Brett, who played the role in the 80s and early 90s, went back to the straight pipe, the dapper suit, and some amazing hair. And Robert Downey Jr. in 2009 was a very desiccated Holmes. He's got the intricate, elaborate dressing gown, but it's pretty much worse for the wearer, as is Sherlock himself. More modern adaptations, such as the one starring Benedict Cumberbatch, that bring Sherlock Holmes into the 21st century, step even further away from Gillette's visual cues for Sherlock, as we can also see with Elementary, as we come into a more 21st century look for the characters, including more progressive casting, more interesting look, at least to me. However, even BBC's modern day Sherlock went back to the well in 2016 for a Christmas special that was set in the Victorian era with Holmes and Watson in full kind of Victorian drag with the curved pipe. And even more recently, we've seen Sherlock in the Victorian era, not the Deerstalker, and actually stepping back to be a supporting character in somebody else's story, as with Enola Holmes. This is Henry Cavill. However, I think there will always be a place for Gillette's interpretation of the character in our popular culture whenever we need that shorthand to tell you that the great detective is on the job. Variety of circumstances in a variety of media. We'll always have Sherlock, and here in Connecticut, we'll always have the castle as well. So I hope that that wasn't too much information too quickly. Steve?
Emily, you got a wonderful already, and I would certainly second that. Thank you for an
Thank you so much.
Presentation. You not only dealt with creativity in Connecticut from Gillette's standpoint, but also from the standpoint of everybody from Mark Twain to Meryl Streep. Very impressive. I know there's...
Well, she was from New Jersey, actually, but...
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about. Well, she did go to Yale drama, right? So we could play.
Yes, Meg Ryan. Meg Ryan is a Fairfield girl.
Oh, all right. Well, that's great. Yeah. Let me ask a couple of questions first about the castle that figured so prominently in the latter part of your presentation. I know you're not directly connected with it or with the Park Service for that matter, but you know a lot about what goes on there, of course. Can you tell us, is it open these days, or how can you go see it?
Well, there's a tale, and I actually kind of anticipated that this would come up, so I have a couple of extra questions, extra slides for you there. And I'm going to share my screen again and put those out for people to kind of see what I'm talking about. The castle is it's a state park administered by the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. It's free to go, as I don't know if people know this, but I hope everybody, if they don't know it, now they do. All state parks are now free. The fees are collected when you register your car with the DMV. So if you have Connecticut license plates, you can go to any state park for free. Gillette Castle is one of the few where you actually do have to pay, but not to get on the grounds. It's if you want to take a tour of the inside of the castle, because of course they have to pay the guides and they have to pay for the maintenance of the castle. However, if you're over 65, you can get a charter, I believe it's called a charter oak passport from Deep, and you can get that at the ticket office right there at Gillette Castle State Park, which will get you the guided tours of both of Gillette Castle State Park as well as Fort Trumbull, and gosh, I can't remember the third one that can sometimes charge admission. However, right now is a bit of a difficult time for all of us, and I was there yesterday and took this picture. The Visitor Center and Castle are closed until further notice. You can keep an eye on the Deep website to find out when they might be open. Now, the grounds are open, and you can certainly hike, and you can see the Aunt Polly, his houseboat that he lived in while the castle was being built. After the castle was built, it caught fire and sank, and the wreckage is still there, and you can explore that, at least when the river is relatively low. However, you can't go into the castle. You can kind of press your nose up against the window of the museum and see one of the locomotives is on display. And you can even go up to the castle itself and push your nose up against the conservatory window and kind of see inside. But as for a tour of the castle, that's not feasible for now. It's really unfortunate because it's a good time. However, I would like to point out that the Friends of Gillette Castle State Park have, last year when they realized they weren't going to be able to open for the 2020 season, they put up a lot of videos. They created a YouTube channel and put up video tours. They're about, each one is about 5 to 8 minutes long, and they highlight different aspects of the castle and the grounds, and they give a lot of really good information, which is really quite interesting. And because it's video, you can actually see things really well, and they demonstrate how the locks worked, including the trick liquor cabinet. So that's a good time. So until you can actually go to the castle, or at least tour the castle, I would highly encourage people to look at that because it's really interesting, and they also have lots of historic photos. They have a picture of Will with Helen Hayes, who was a frequent guest at the castle with her mother, and that kind of thing. They even have an oral history from an older woman who met Will when she was very young, and he actually took her for a ride on the railroad, and she was absolutely terrified out of her mind the whole time. And so that was a one-time occurrence for her family.
That's very cool.
So yeah, I would say by all means, check out that YouTube channel.
Emily, let me ask you a very different question that relates to what the last presentation we had was by Kathy Mayer. She spoke to us about P.T. Barnum. She's the head of the Barnum Museum.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things she mentioned about Barnum was that he was an abolitionist,
Mm-hmm.
in favor of women's suffrage, and a heavy-duty temperance person, which sounds exactly like your description of Will Gillette's father. Did
Yeah,
he
Senator
involve-
Francis. Yeah.
Did they have any connection? They were rough contemporaries, right?
Not that I know of. I didn't really look into that. I think, I'm not sure, because Barnum, when I talked about how it wasn't even respectable to go to the theater, and actually Will's plays and his work actually helped improve those matters because people felt like they could go and see The Professor or Held by the Enemy or Secret Service, and that would be certainly nothing that would be morally compromising. Barnum, however, people did not feel that way about Barnum, at least people in the sort of Nook Farm strata of society. That was seen as very vulgar. I'm sure his money spent very well, though, so I'm not sure how much involvement he would have had in Connecticut politics, or how welcome he would have been, or how welcome he would have felt. In fact, before he married Helen, Will dated an actress named Georgia Caven, and his family did not like her at all. They thought she was grasping and conniving, and when I read what they had to say about her, I think a certain amount of it was classist. She was from a not so elevated background from Maine, and also I think where they were willing to tolerate Will being a professional actor, I don't think that they felt the same way about women in the profession. And that's a long-winded way of saying that P.T. Barnum would not have been considered very respectable at all if even a straight actress was considered a little bit déclassée. However, I can't speak with any expertise. That's sheer speculation on my part. Oddly, it didn't occur to me to look into that.
Well, his admission was 25 cents, so he was a little under the theater admission that Gillette charged, but appealing to more of a mass audience, I think, than was typical in the time. The other question I have, and it's the last one I'll have on these Barnum-related things. Barnum, after his museum in New York City burnt down, built Madison Square Garden. You showed pictures of Madison Square Theater. Is there any connection between the two, do you know?
Not that I know of. Location, location, location. If you, that was, oh, hold on. I think if you'll bear with me for a second, I'll go back to that slide because it actually explained exactly where that theater was located.
Yeah, they gave the street address at the bottom of it, and I didn't, Madison, but I didn't.
Hang on, let me get out the trusty reading glasses. 24th Street near Broadway. I don't know how close it was to Madison Square Garden in that area. I'm not too familiar with that part of town.
All right.
So I'm sorry, I don't have any insight there.
I'm going to take you in a very different direction then, and that's with respect to the scandal in Bohemia, which you mentioned, Gillette adapted. But Holmes, Doyle at one point told him, don't put any romance in anything. Scandal.
Yeah, that was his original stipulation. He changed his mind when, you know, he started thinking about the commercial possibilities.
You know, Scandal in Bohemia is about the closest Holmes ever gets to having a romantic relationship, at least his great admiration of Ellen Adler. Is it Ellen Adler? What's her name?
Irene.
Yes.
Irene Adler.
Of course. How could I get that wrong?
Well, that was actually a lot of Sherlock fans, particularly modern ones. I think 19th century audiences, 19th, early 20th century audiences didn't have quite the proprietary relationship with media properties that we do now. We can feel very entitled as fans, like, how could he possibly have a romance? And so more modern audiences, like, kind of look at Gillette's work and say, oh man, he had that romance with Miss Alice Faulkner. I don't know about that. And these same fans are very clear that there was absolutely no romance between Sherlock and Irene. How dare you impugn the good man like that? He was just not interested, and on and on and on. It's a thing.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, that's very encouraging there. I wonder if you talk just a little bit about copyright issues in that time. I gathered Doyle experienced those knockoffs that he really couldn't do anything about, as long you could take the character, put it in another setting, and it wasn't considered a copyright violation in that era, even though today it would be. I mean, you get statutory damages and a whole bunch of other things, which would be a huge number.
Okay, well, yes. I think they had a different attitude toward fan fiction back then. Charles Rogers, when he put that play on in 1894, Doyle did try to take him to court, and the court in London, and I'm given to understand that there are attorneys present today who maybe be able to school me a little bit better on copyright and intellectual property history. However, the basic determination by the British courts was that as long as the Rogers play didn't use any dialogue from Doyle's stories, didn't use any specific plot elements from those stories, that he could go ahead and have a Sherlock play. You couldn't copyright a title, was the argument. Now, when Will went to England in 1899 and met Doyle, he was also in England for the express purpose of having a copyright performance. It was a one-time performance on June 12th, 1899 of his play, to establish that as an intellectual property that they intended to use. And basically, this is our copyright. Back then, that was what you did. Publishing a play wasn't enough. You had to actually perform it, at least in England. And of course, the next morning, Charles Rogers had died by then, but his heirs were in court suing Doyle, Gillette, Frohman, and so on, saying, hey, Sherlock Holmes is a stage play. That's our thing. Wildly paraphrasing, of course. The courts basically said, yeah, right. You can keep on with your little Sherlock Holmes adaptation, Charles Rogers, but let Gillette can do this, Doyle can do this, Frohman can do this, and they can even call it an authorized adaptation. And it's interesting because Rogers' adaptation was very popular in England because people really wanted more Holmes adventures, and since at the time Doyle wasn't writing them, he would revive the character in 1901. They were taking what they could get. And actually, once Gillette's production started touring, Rogers' work kind of suffered in comparison, and really Gillette's adaptation became where it was at. So, but it was really a lot of lawsuits were going on. Really would have been a lucrative time for a certain segment of the population.
I'm sure it was for them. So when Gillette was touring, as going to England to do that, were there performances going on in the United States, say in New York, that had other actors playing the role?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Held by the Enemy, this was back when when Helen was still alive, they took Held by the Enemy to London and he went with it as the director. However, they hired a British cast to play that because at the time, American cultural products in general and theater in particular was seen as very not our kind of thing by the British. And they did enjoy Held by the Enemy with a British cast, but it was really Secret Service that he performed in himself in 1897 that they really appreciated. And also in that cast in London was a very young 17-year-old Ethel Barrymore. However, yeah, as I said, Frohman taking advantage of the infrastructure of the railway system and theaters throughout the country would have up to 5 companies touring with a property at any time, at any given time. And in fact, the Held by the Enemy and the Secret Service, as I said, he kind of both sides of the Civil War and kind of looking at the human element and not saying that one side was all good or the other side was all bad. And part of that may have been a commercial decision because with that humanizing of both sides, he was able to play that in the South as well as the North. And I think certain elements of the South still would have resented any implication that there even was a civil war, or certainly that they had lost it. However, there were commercial opportunities as well. I'm not going to assume that he made those artistic decisions in a total vacuum.
I think as long as you called it the War of Northern Aggression, you'd get away with it in the South, right?
And he was willing to do that.
He would.
He would do that. His background notwithstanding.
So I would take you in a little bit different direction back in early time with William Gillette. When he was still a boy, I think you said he was 10 or 11, he built a locomotive. Was that a working locomotive or just?
It was a stationary locomotive. So it was, the idea was that if you got it out, you could make it work. But he was had it up in the attic, and I don't know that his parents would have been too excited about having, something that actually
he had a station
up there in that attic. I mean, that is a nice house.
Yeah.
You would not. And by the way, about that house, that is a very nice house that no longer stands. Nook Farm was pretty much demolished. I mean, you can see sort of reconstituted version. The Twain House was preserved, the Stowe House and some associated buildings with the Stowe Center. However, the land that was, that Francis built that house on is now the Hartford Public High School, magnet school for, I believe, engineering and nursing. And so I'd like to think that Francis would have approved of that, being the great advocate for public education that he was. But maybe he was a not in my backyard type. I don't know. It is in his backyard, so.
Well, let's take him to that stamp invention, the patent that got patented. What in the world did a stamp have to do with theater? Does it have any particular application?
I have no idea how he got interested in that. I mean, he would have seen a lot of, documents, of course, maybe drafts of plays or something. I mean, as I said, the technology already existed. His goal was to invent something that was easier to use and that the stamps would be more legible. But I don't know what inspired him to take an interest in that particular piece of technology. And I don't think that ever actually went into production with any of his patents on it.
Were the beautiful drawings that you showed us and commented on, was that actually Gillette's own drawing, or did he have a professional drafter?
I would guess that there was probably a professional drafter involved. I mean, the U.S. Patent Office does have very specific requirements for how clear a drawing needs to be. So I would imagine that as much as he liked to sketch and design new things, I think that, and he would have had a working model of it, obviously, but I think he probably got a professional draftsman to do those. But they are just beautiful, aren't they?
They are extraordinary. Let me ask you, after his wife passed away, and it's you told a beautiful story about their romance, did he ever remarry or have another romantic relationship after that?
Well, it seems as though he probably had some very discreet kind of low-key romances with with actresses maybe, but he never remarried. The story goes that, well, he told people that he had made a deathbed promise to her that he would not remarry. And this is where we get into the Nook Farm of it all, when all of these people were constantly visiting one another and constantly writing letters to the people who lived next door, and they were incredible gossips. They were also kind of matchmakers, and they were trying constantly to fix him up with people, with daughters, nieces, whatever. They say, oh, well, if you made a deathbed promise to Helen, she would never hold you to that. You don't have to honor a deathbed promise. See? Or you don't need to worry about religious incompatibility, because Will was not a religious man, but many of these daughters, nieces, whatever, were, or their families were. You don't need to please marry our daughter, marry her. Oh, no, I couldn't possibly. And I think that really, again, he did have some discreet love affairs with actresses, but there was none of this, no floods of tears and doors slamming and getting in the papers with scandal or anything like that.
Well, apart from being a very handsome guy, was he also a good catch because he had a lot of money? The castle looks like it took a lot of money to put it together. And did he get that from the productions or from?
That was from the productions. As I said, when Francis died, he was actually deeply in debt. And Will had to go back to work almost immediately and try to make money to support his family. And actually, he did make a lot of money from the plays, both performing in them and writing them. And of course, they were further licensed to other companies. Also, Lily and George, his sister and brother-in-law, they had 3 children, but only one survived to adulthood. And it was his niece, Margaret, Will's niece, Margaret Warren. He was very close to her, but she was she suffered a number of ailments and spent most of her life traveling to various spots around the world, really, to seek treatment. And he subsidized that because the Warrens, despite George Warren being a banker, they were not a particularly prosperous family. And he helped pay for Margaret's medical bills. And she lived with him at the castle, and she probably would have inherited it all if she unfortunately died in 1931. So, and she never married or had children either. So the castle itself cost in 1914 to 1919 about $1 million to build. It's kind of tricky to calculate inflation. I threw it into the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index inflation calculator, and that's told me that today that would be about $26 million. And incidentally, the 1927 railway system on the property cost $50,000, which I'm now told is about $750,000.
My word. Well, let me ask you one question. Again, goes back to P.T. Barnum in this respect. One of the things that Kathy Mara Park pointed out was that Barnum didn't have anybody who really preserved his legacy after he died. And that's why he got sometimes a bad rep from people who weren't properly representing him, unlike
like me.
Walt Disney had Roy Disney to protect the reputation. Gillette's reputation has always seemed to be very high. Was there somebody who was engaged in preserving his reputation after his death?
Well, he was very well thought of wherever he went. When he was in North Carolina and Tryon.
He didn't need anything to preserve his reputation. He was already.
Well, I think there were a lot of people who preserved it, who were proud of their association with him. And certainly the good people of Tryon, North Carolina, remembered him well as being a good neighbor, somebody who brought a lot of people and a lot of prestige to the town. And he also staged special performances of Sherlock Holmes there. And actually at the Polk County Historical Society Museum, they actually do have some of his Sherlock props that they get to keep, that they kept in there. As for his legacy, when he died, he left his estate to his cousin, Joe Hooker, and his Nellie had, as I said, a younger half-brother, Hall Cohen was his name, and he was very close to Will, and as was Joe. Joe and his wife honeymooned at the castle, and I keep wanting to call him Hal. His name is Hall. Hall and his wife actually lived at the castle along with the cats and Will and various staff members for many years, and those two men inherited when he died, and there was a famous stipulation in his will about what was to happen to the castle. He did not want it sold to a blithering saphead who was unable to appreciate what he had or with what he was surrounded. And in fact, when Joe and Hall were trying to sell the castle, which was kind of a hard sell, that's a bit of a white elephant to try to unload, they actually had a buyer on the line, and then they thought, oh wait, this guy's kind of a blue saphead, and they backed away from the sale. They, in terms of the material aspects, they sold the locomotives. There were two engines, a steam and an electric passenger cars. They actually sold those to Lake Compounce in Bristol. They remained in service until 1991. And Lake Compounce decommissioned them. They donated them back to the castle, and that's how you can see it in the museum today. Eventually, they sold the property in late 1943 to the state of Connecticut for $30,000, which, getting back to my inflation calculator, is about $450,000 today. As far as the legacy, because the state had invested, not just buying the property, but also making improvements to it to make it easier to visit, they'd invested a lot of money, so they wanted to make sure that people knew who Will was. Certainly, the people of East Haddam had very fond memories of Will as a neighbor and as an actor. And so, again, as you said, there were a lot of people who were willing to step forward and really preserve his papers and for us to enjoy and research today.
Well, Emily, on that wonderful note about the legacy, I think we can pretty much bring this to a close unless Kim has something to say that would wrap it up. But I do want especially to express for all of us how wonderful a presentation you made and how much you covered.
Well,
I think we got a great tour of the 19th and early 20th century from
it was
a lot of different.
It was a lot to get through without, really, I could talk about Will all night, except my voice is starting to give out.
I'm
Well,
gonna.
thank you so much, Kim.
I agree with Steve. That was just fabulous, Emily, and thank you, Steve, too, for your great moderating and fielding the questions. And what a wonderful way to wrap up this really, really great lecture series. And like I said before, I encourage anyone who didn't see all 5 of them to go on our YouTube channels and watch them, because they're, especially as a collective, they just make you really feel proud to have lived in Connecticut. Really wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily and Steve. And good night to everyone. And we hope to see you again next year when we have our next lecture series.
Emily, congratulations. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Okay, good night.
Good night.